Welcome to our meeting today, Beyond the Binary, Marxism, Gender and Trans Politics. I'm the chair for this meeting. My name is Ioana Ioannou. I'm from UCL. I'm a member of the Socialist Worker Party. I'm a member of my UCU LGBT committee. And I do identify as non-binary. You see, I was identified as a woman when I was 18, but over the years, well, I can tell you for sure, I'm not a man, but I'm not think I'm a woman either. Well, what does Marxism has to say? And should we be precious about the gender binary, or should we just explore the fluidity of gender and express ourselves in a way we find suitable? Our speakers for today is Sue Caldwell, a teacher, a member of NUT and leading member of the Socialist Workers' Party. She's going to speak for 35 minutes, and then we can have a discussion.
Okay, thanks very much, comrades, and welcome to the meeting. Recently, I think it was in June last year, the Time magazine ran a edition with a front page declaring that trans was America's new civil rights frontier. I think that kind of raises the question a little bit about what happened to the other civil rights. You know, have they really been won? Oh, well, we've done black rights, we've done women's rights, let's move on to, we've done gay rights, let's move on to trans rights now. And I think in a way, that's part of the problem in terms of some of the arguments that we come across today, that actually those issues haven't been resolved. But of course, what we do have within society is a much greater visibility of people who express not just a range of sexualities, but also a range of genders. People who are openly transgender, people who identify as non-binary, as genderqueer, as gender fluid, and so on, including some very high-profile figures like Miley Cyrus, who identifies as gender neutral. People might be aware of Ruby Rose from Orange is the New Black, who identifies as gender fluid, and so on. And most surveys nowadays, it was quite interesting, I think there was a survey last year that said about half of 18 to 24-year-olds would not place themselves at either end of a gender binary, but would place themselves somewhere in between. The latest British Social Attitudes survey that just came out very recently, was the first time they actually examined attitudes towards transgender people, came out with quite a high level of acceptance of transgender people. However, it's not all one way, is it? Because at the same time, when it was drilled down into, well, do you think police officers or teachers should be openly transgender? Actually, the percentages went down a bit, and we know that there is still a lot of hostility within society to people who break from stereotypical norms. We know there is still a huge amount of self-harm within the trans community, around 50% attempting suicide, and so on and so forth. I was at the TUC LGBT committee conference on Thursday and Friday, and we learnt about a worker at the V&A Museum who was actually stabbed by somebody who had been harassing them, transphobically harassing them over a long period of time, but this person themselves now finds themselves on the receiving end of a disciplinary because presumably they somehow encouraged it through their gender expression. This may well end up being quite a big issue, by the way, to look out for in terms of standing in solidarity. I'm not going to go through in detail the figures about trans oppression or about the different ways in which people have fought back around trans and non-binary politics throughout history, because there is a session immediately after this one with an excellent panel which I think will go through that a little bit more. What I want to try and do really is to, if you like, try to frame a bit of a theoretical background, both around what we mean by gender and gender identity, and also about the politics of oppression. And in many ways, comrades, this will be a bit new, actually, because one of the things that we say about Marxism, isn't it, is that it's a living, breathing body of theory that constantly has to be adapted to practice. You can't go back to Capital and say, what does Marx say about non-binary people? You know, this is something that we have to explore for ourselves. So I really would welcome people, actually, getting up and, you know, throwing in their 2 pennyworth to the contribution and the discussion. Please do feel free to do that, because not so long ago, if you talked about gender politics, people would think that what you meant was basically why are women oppressed and what shapes that oppression and what do we do about women's oppression. In other words, people would think you meant women if you talked about gender politics. But actually, young people nowadays, when they talk about gender politics, aren't talking about that at all. They're talking about their gender identity, how that is expressed, what it means to be a man or a woman. Can you be something in between? It is completely different terms of terms of reference, and that's really what I want to begin by talking about, because you would have thought that within this, really, the right of, you know, if you go back to what I said at the beginning, the new civil rights frontier, people fighting for their rights and so on, you'd have thought the fundamental right to identify as your chosen gender would be something that people who fought the previous battles would actually identify with. In particular, women, actually, who've been forced by gender stereotyping into all sorts of horribly oppressive situations. But actually you find that this is not the case, and that a whole number of people who call themselves feminists, I don't want to use the term feminist as a kind of all-embracing thing, because within that there's lots of different attitudes. I also, to be honest, don't very much like the acronym TERF, which a lot of people use, which stands for Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminism, which is but as a body of ideology of feminists who want to say that you can't just call yourself a woman, you can't just identify as a woman. That is really the acronym that is often used to describe that. I prefer to use transcritical feminists as opposed to trans-supportive feminists, because you do within that get quite a wide range. It's not a big thing, but I just thought it's worth mentioning some of these terms, because again, a lot of these terms are quite new. And so what you find is people like Germaine Greer, for example, you know, in many parts of the feminist movement, quite revered for her contribution and so on and so forth, actually coming out and making extremely offensive remarks about trans women in particular, about how, you can't just lop your dick off and call yourself. Well, this is disgustingly offensive, as if you can reduce what trans people go through to something like that. She compares it to dogs changing species, and it's really quite horrible the way that she writes about that she writes about trans people. Julie Bindel, another well-known feminist, has written quite a lot about how, these days this transgender lobby is just grabbing people who really just want to wear trousers and whipping them off to go and have surgery and so on. It's complete nonsense. I'll come back to a quote from Julie Bindel a bit later. And by the way, this isn't just about old feminists against new feminists. I was at a Women of the World conference at South Bank University a few months ago, and one of the speakers was Angela Davis, who some people may know as a great fighter for black and women's rights going back to the 1960s and the Black Power movement and so on. Actually, she was very, very good on the question. One of the things that she said was, what would it be like? Just imagine what it would be like if the sign for the women's movement was a black trans woman. What would that mean for the movement? Wouldn't that be a good thing? These people who have had to struggle for their recognition of what it is to be a woman. And actually, that's quite a controversial thing to say, actually, generally within a feminist environment. So it's not completely older generation against new generation. I am, by the way, going to focus quite a lot on trans women, particularly because that is where the argument comes. But when I'm talking generally about gender, and about siding with the oppressed, I think, and I would hope that what I say is generalising, is applicable to people of all genders. So I want to really just start with this question of what is gender, because there are many ways in which there's a kind of simplistic impression, which is that your sex is biologically what you were born with. You look at your genitals, write something on the birth certificate, that's what you are. Whereas your gender is something that is much more what you feel. And I think often as a kind of working description, that works in a lot of instances. But I actually think the situation is much more complex than that. And I want to explain why. First of all, let's take the question of biological sex. Are the biological sex differences really that clear? And do they fall that clearly on a within a binary system? Now, one of the ways in which this has been popularised is in the brain, actually. People like to say there's a male brain and a female brain, and they have different characteristics, and they've done all these sorts of studies, and they've decided that the reason why women like wearing pink is because back in the day when they were the gatherers looking for the berries, they had to train their eyes. It's complete bollocks, actually, because up until the Victorian era, the colour for boys was pink and the colour for girls was blue. So, but all these sorts of ridiculous theories come out about how women are more nurturing and men are more aggressive and so on and so on and so forth. We had this around the financial crash, didn't we? If only all the bankers were women, they wouldn't be filled with all this testosterone that made them go out and compete with each other and lose all our money and things like that. So that's one argument, and these things have been studied actually in quite a lot of detail. I mean, some of the more stupid things it's quite easy to trivialise, but these things have been studied actually in some detail. Sorry, I've got a million quotes over here, and I know that some of this is going to go wrong. But this one is from a neuroscientist called Daphne Joel, writing in the National something of Science, which I can't read, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in America. Okay. Very respected, peer-reviewed journal, etc., 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 looking into male-female brains. And this is what they say. Our study demonstrates that although there are sex-gender differences, she's kind of using the words interchangeably here, in brain structure, brains do not fall into two classes, one typical of males and the other typical of females, nor are they aligned along a male brain, female brain continuum. These findings are in line with previous reports that sex-gender differences... sorry, that wasn't the bit I wanted to read, but that's true as well. The lack of internal consistency in human, blah, 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 blah. We should shift from thinking of brains as falling into two classes, one typical of males and the other typical of females, to appreciating the variability of the human brain mosaic. And I think that idea of the variability of a human brain mosaic is a much more complex way, an accurate way, well, the scientists are saying it, so I agree with them, that we should think about brains. So that's the question of the brain. Now, of course, people will say, oh, yeah, OK, well, that's brains. But come on, there's an obvious physical difference, isn't there, between men and women? And you can just look at them in a certain way. Unfortunately, trans and non-binary people tend to have their genitalia talked about a lot more than anybody else, as if it's anybody else's business. But, but come on, we can look, and and over there is the men, and over there is the women, and so on. But actually, even that is not that clear, as it turns out. A lot of people will know this anyway. But there's a very good article that appeared in Nature magazine in 2015 called "Sex Redefined," and it challenges a clear physical sexual binary. And one of the instances that they report on is of a man who came into surgery for a hernia operation. This person was 70 years old and had fathered 4 children. And during the course of the operation, they discovered that he had a womb, in fact, which actually then makes you think, well, then what is our definition of male and female? Is your definition of female that you have a womb? Whereabouts does that come? And I want to read a few quotes from that article. This is John Ackerman, who studies sex development and endocrinology at the University College London's Institute of Child Health. He says, "I think there's much greater diversity within male or female, and there is certainly an area of overlap where some people can't easily define themselves within the binary structure." And this is Arthur Arnold from the University of California, Los Angeles. "The main problem with a strong dichotomy is that there are intermediate cases that push the limits and ask us to figure out exactly where the dividing line is between males and females." And he goes on to say that's a very difficult problem because sex can be defined in a number of ways. And I want to just hold up a chart that you won't be able to read, but honest, you can come and have a look after if you want to. But what this chart categorises is actually 7, if you like, broad categories, going from typical male, XY chromosome, what their gonads are, what their genitals are, what their other characteristic examples are, through to typical female, with a whole range of varieties in between, including the bit I've highlighted there, rare reports of predominantly XY people, that's the male chromosome, rare reports of predominantly XY people conceiving and bearing a healthy child. So, now, if you go back through history, actually people have known this. Again, I'm not going to go into it because this will be covered a little bit in the panel later. But you go back to Native Americans who talked about two-spirit people and often were comfortable accepting a whole range of different genders. Stop and think about it. Why should there just be two? Why? People have accepted throughout history these differences, and actually science is backing them up. And I just want to give you a few more quotes. Sorry, it's a really good article, so I'm going to give you lots of quotes for it, and then I'll move on. They're saying that the report goes on to say things like, biologists have been building a more nuanced view of sex, but society has yet to catch up. And one of the things that they talk about, by the way, in here, and this is something that we really need to think about, is the fact that in America it's even worse than here. In America this happens routinely on a daily basis. That babies who are born with indeterminate sexual characteristics are basically, against their will, operated on in order to make them conform to the gender that the surgeon thinks they probably should be. I think that's criminal, actually. Why? Why is it so important that we put on the birth certificate boy or girl? I personally think we should leave the birth certificate blank until the person is old enough to decide if and what they want to put on the birth certificate. But society is obsessed by it, isn't it? It's the question you always get asked, is it a boy or a girl? Are you going to paint your nursery blue or green? Green? Where'd that come from? You know what I mean? So, society is really quite obsessed by it. I will come back to that question. I'll come back to that question a little later. I'm chucking stuff on the floor now. So the quote that I want to finish with, which is my favourite quote from the article, really. This is again coming back to Edward Villain. He says, "My feeling is that since there is not one biological parameter that takes over every other parameter," he's talking about the mixture of genes, chromosomes, hormones, etc., etc. Since there is not one biological parameter that takes over every other parameter, at the end of the day, gender identity seems to be the most reasonable parameter. In other words, if you want to know whether someone is male or female, it may be best just to ask. And I think that is a really nice quote, really, and I think that is really where we should be going, and something that, as socialists, we should absolutely defend. Because there's a tendency to say, isn't there, that really, come on, everybody is male, you know they're male, or everybody is female and you know they're female, and there might be a few rare cases in between, but actually that's where something's gone wrong. And I think that we need to utterly oppose that and instead be celebrating diversity and variety within our society in all of its aspects, including on the question of gender. And by the way, Just to bring this up to date, I've got last weekend's paper. People may remember the case of Semenya, who is an athlete who runs for South Africa as part of the women's athletics team. And they didn't really like the fact that she kept winning all these races and she was running a bit too fast. And so they started to say that maybe she's not really a woman. Now, she was accepted as a woman, actually, but let me read this quote to you about the inquiry. This is a report. Semenya may face prospect of Olympic ban in wake of new study. And part of the quote says, female athletes with very high levels of naturally occurring testosterone. Think about that for a minute. She's female. This is natural. What's the problem? And, think about male athletes. Are we all built like Usain Bolt? Should we say, oh, that's not fair, he should undergo some surgery or some hormone treatment to slow him down a bit? No, this applies to people who seem to challenge the gender stereotypes. We've got to do something about this. Either she's got to take hormone therapy or she's got to have some kind of operation. That is the effect of gender policing within our society. So if the question of sex and biology isn't that straightforward, then what about gender? Is it then, therefore, completely socially conditioned? Is it something that really doesn't exist at all, but we are conditioned by society to accept certain gender roles, and that at the end of the day is where people's gender identity comes from? So I think I mean, of course, there is a huge amount of normative gender conditioning that goes on within society. But nevertheless, I do think that we need to think about think about that for a minute, and whether we want to just talk in the realm of ideas and not so much in the material world. Because if you're saying essentially that people who feel gender dysphoria, body dysphoria, which if you talk to people, is a real physical pain, are really just looking at, they were born a man and they're looking at women and they're just thinking, oh, I might like to just wear a dress, or I'm born a girl, but I might like to just wear trousers. People will tell talk to people, because they will tell you that that is not true, and that they tried that, and that they tried being a tomboy or whatever it was, and that it did not work. So I think we then have to start to to really question whether we are talking about something that is totally socially conditioned. Of course, social conditioning has a huge part to play within gender roles, and the whole thing that follows on from writing boy or girl on that gender on that birth certificate, and everything that goes and everything that goes along with it. But does it follow that gender identity is really just your reaction to that? And you see, I think the problem is that if you go down that route, you actually end up with the place where a lot of the transcritical feminists are. And I'll read you the quote from. This is a quote from Julie Bindel from October last year, and she's basically criticising what she calls the transgender lobby, who want to, anybody who expresses any gender non-conforming attitude just gets whisked off to have surgery and so on and so forth. She says, and this is a very prominent lesbian feminist writer, by the way. If I were a teenager today, well-meaning liberal teachers would probably tell me that I was trapped in the wrong body. They might refer me to a psychiatrist who would prescribe fistfuls of hormones or other drugs. And terrifyingly, I might easily tell that to anybody who's tried to get transgender surgery. I might easily be recommended for gender reassignment surgery just because I didn't like the pink straitjacket imposed on girls. And he goes on to talk about how having transgender surgery is using a surgeon's knife to operate on society's problems. So I think actually we have to reject the idea that it is simply about social conditioning. And by the way, a figure they often like to use, they say 80% of gender non-conforming young people actually go on to live happily fulfilled lives in the gender that they were assigned at birth. Well, actually, that's true, but that's because gender non-conforming covers a whole range of things. It doesn't necessarily mean people who experience gender dysphoria. What we want to know is, what are you going to do about the 20% who do experience gender dysphoria, who don't identify with the gender that they were born with, and how are you going to stand up and how are you going to stand up for their rights? So. I think when people say that gender identity is something that they feel, I think we mustn't go along with the feminists and then go, oh, well, that means you think you've got a women's brain and there's no such thing as a women's brain. Actually, when people say they feel something, it's much more than that. It's, and I do think that we have to talk much more about an interaction between the physical and the, an interaction between the physical and the, and the social. And there's often a false polarisation that is put around by both sides of the argument, actually, that either these things must be, in your brain or in your biology, or they must be totally socially conditioned. And I think as Marxists, we have to fight for something that talks about an interaction between the two. I like this quote from neuroscientist Cordelia Fine. She says that we are all, quote, the result of a sheer exhilarating tangle of continuous interaction among genes, brain and the environment. And I really like that. I like it because it gives an idea of the messiness of it, but it also says, come on, this is exhilarating, this is great, let's celebrate this variety and diversity. And that's where I think the Marxist method is a really good method, that we talk about what makes us who we are is the interaction between our physical selves and the world around us. But also, the other thing where Marxism, I think, helps us is that it directs us to say that, actually, this is not an abstract question. No, this isn't a question that's going to be solved in the abstract. Ooh, what is gender? Let's sit around and think about it, and then when we've got a proper definition, we'll decide what to do with it. Actually, this is something that is that needs to be resolved in practice. And Marx, for example, writing in the Thesis on Feuerbach, says the dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking, which is isolated from practice, is a purely scholastic question. And as against that, what we have to say is, in practice, you can sit around, to be honest, what we're talking about is something here that's a bit messy, isn't it? And that maybe we don't quite really understand it. But what we do understand is that people questioning their gender exist, that gender dysphoria exists, and that allowing people to live as their chosen gender, whether that requires surgery or not, we know has a fantastically positive effect on their health and enables them to live healthy, happy lives. And therefore, in practice, it's incumbent upon us to stand with those people against their oppression and to fight for their rights and the services and the services that they need. So I'm going to have to move on a little bit. Sorry. So the question then becomes: how do we get involved in practice? Around these issues? First of all, standing in solidarity with the oppressed. You know, when I hear some people like Julie Bindel and these kinds of people, Germaine Greer, it makes me think of the Malcolm X quote, which says, if you're not careful, they'll have you loving the oppressor and hating the oppressed. And often what you find is transgender people get blamed for everything from, you're just holding up stereotypical gender norms. Look, if you transform to become, which is what they like to say, a man, then you're going to, you're this butch man with big tattoos and all the rest of it. And if you transform to become a woman, then you're going to be a really girly girl and put on makeup. Number one, these people have never actually spoken to trans people. Number two, what do you think happens in the world of cis women or non-trans women? Who the bloody hell do you think they put on the pages of the magazines? Cindy Crawford. Is Cindy Crawford typical of non-trans women? Why should trans people be held up to any higher standard than the rest of the population? This stereotyping comes from society. It doesn't come from trans people who, just like anybody else, exist in all sorts of shapes and sizes and all the rest of it. Secondly, the question of access to toilets, access to women's safe spaces and so on. You would think violence against women never existed until trans men started wanting, trans women started wanting to use women's toilets. The reality is that 2 people a week still are murdered in this country by their current or ex-partners. Putting gender neutral instead of a picture of somebody in a skirt, which I never understand, well, I'm supposed to go to the toilet, on a toilet is not what is going to stop violence against women. In fact, it is trans people and trans women in particular who are overwhelmingly the victims of such violence. And the question I'd like to ask is this. If you're going to say only these people can come into this room, who is going to police that? Who's going to stand at the door of the toilet and throw people out if they don't really look properly like women? I've been stopped by a policeman for going into the women's toilet at London Bridge Station. There, you can go on Facebook and see police dragging women who don't look like women out of bathrooms because of transphobia. I'm not, by the way, trying to say that it's any worse for than it is for trans women and so on. This is a way in which we need to stand together, isn't it? Because an attack on one is an attack on all of us. And actually, funnily enough, far from reinforcing gender stereotyping, as more people have felt confident to come out and fight and express their genders, what you've actually found is a much wider variety. I think it's really bloody great that somebody with a beard can call himself a woman, because a lot of us have got bloody pissed off with having to keep worrying about whether we got bloody hairs on our face. And this is something that we should celebrate. We shouldn't be lining up and going, how could you possibly be a woman? You've got a beard. Oh my God, shock horror. There's a blogger who I'm not going to bother to find. Sorry, too much. Sorry, running out of time, and I'll find some of the quotes for later. But there's a blogger called Sam Hope who I think is quite good. I don't really know very much about them, but they will write quite a lot of good stuff in response to the transcritical feminists, transcritical feminists about this. But and the final argument that you often get is about, oh well, and this particularly applies to trans women. You grew up as a man, therefore you had male privilege, and you cannot therefore understand what it is like to be a woman. First of all, I think to call anybody who has grown up with gender dysphoria that was some kind of privilege, I think is grossly inaccurate and offensive. But secondly, what do you exactly mean when you say you've grown up as a man? Because most people who transition knew from quite a young age, actually, that something wasn't quite right. And that meant that when they looked around at society and they looked at the gender roles in society, they didn't internalise what they saw men doing, they internalised what they saw women doing. So to say that they were, somehow separated from oppression, now of course it's different. I'm not trying to claim it's the same. Of course it's different. But can we really say that there is a unique experience of oppression that is common to all women? Every woman's experience of oppression is going to be shaped by a whole range of things. Most especially by class, actually, because because you might be responsible for looking after the kids, but if you can afford a living nanny, if you can buy your way out of a violent relationship, all these sorts of things, it doesn't mean to say that you're not oppressed as a woman, but it's a different experience of oppression. And I think that we need to encompass the experience of trans women's oppression, of trans women's oppression within that. Okay, now of course we do fight for women's rights and against women's oppression, and that's important. But what I want to really quite strongly argue is that those are trans rights too, and it's not the case that one has to negatively impact upon the other. And I can think of two obvious areas in which really we need to be coming together to fight. One is around the question of control of our own bodies. It's a fight that has been a fight around the women's movement for a long time over the question of abortion rights. And by the way, another argument you get is, oh, these trans women, they want us to stop, these trans people, they want us to stop using a women's rights. Actually, that's not true. We do understand that the reason that we have to fight for abortion rights is because of the social conditioning of women and women's oppression. However, and the abortion rights campaign does this, we also want to say in our literature that we are inclusive of people who don't identify as women and want to use the services. But it's not just around the question of abortion rights, though, access to the NHS, access to medical treatment. You can think of lots of areas in which really these fights ought to be coming together. And it's not the case that they are counterposed to each other. And the other, of course, is around the whole question of fighting and challenging gender stereotyping. I want really just to finish off by coming on to some of the theories about fighting oppression within the movement, you see, because when you talk about the arguments that come from particular strands of feminism, they are underpinned by patriarchy theory. I said this in a contribution in a meeting earlier about patriarchy theory. A lot of people just understand it as meaning women's oppression, but actually it means a bit more than that. It's an explanation of that oppression, because what they said was that really Marxism and class oppression and all the rest of it can't really explain women's oppression, so we need something else, and we need to fight a different battle. I've just found a quote. So this is a feminist called Finn Mackay who's talking about the arguments between radical feminists and queer theorists, but is supporting the radical feminist side. And they talk about radical feminism's understanding of gender as a system in which one gender, male, has economic and political power and the other, female, does not. And the dominant group has an investment in keeping it that way. And that will echo also, to be honest, with what a lot of people on the other side of the debate often say. A lot of people who adopt queer theory, adopted it as a reaction really to what they saw as the backward and inward lookingness of identity politics, but actually took on a lot of the stuff about who benefits, and a lot of it was dressed up in the language of post-structuralism, the arguments of Foucault that you can't really fight these big battles for changing society anymore. You've just got to fight lots of little battles, and they end up being about language and this sort of stuff. I don't really have time to go into it, but they also use the language of privilege, and I think that's idea that really, unless you suffer from that particular oppression, then somehow you have some kind of privilege and therefore investment in maintaining that oppression, I think is fundamentally wrong. You know, the question of abortion actually has always been about a women's right to choose, but it's also something that has been fought and won inside the trade union movement, and that a lot of working class men have identified with, because they understand that it is in their interest too, not to be trapped in a tower block with lots of children and all the rest of it, and not having any kind of control in that way, fighting against low pay and all these kinds of things. I don't really have time to go into it a lot, but hopefully other people will. And the problem then is that you can end up on the other side, if you like, and some of the people that tried to oppose, for example, Julie Bindel recently was speaking at an event in Manchester. And there was an argument that she shouldn't even be allowed to speak, that we should close the place down. It was a working class library, and something that had been a resource for working class people in the area for many years. They wanted to close it down and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, I think this is completely the wrong way, as it ends up being a moralistic way to go about fighting the argument, instead of actually thinking that we can fight together and try and actually win people over in that way. So I'm not for closing down debate. I'm not for no platform, which is a specific policy that was designed to stop fascism. It's not about saying we don't agree with you and therefore we're not going to argue and so on. And what's interesting recently is there's been a whole spate of union conferences that have started to pass policies supportive of the right of trans people to self-identify and so on. And I think that for us, we have to have that fundamental belief that ideas can change and that they can change on a large scale as well. And I think this is what is missing really from both the kind of feminist argument rooted in patriarchy theory and from arguments around language and performance and so on that are rooted in queer theory and post-structuralism. And that is that we can actually change people's ideas through struggle. And that is fundamentally what we have to talk about. That who is it that benefits from gender stereotyping within society? It is the ruling class that benefit. Who is it that benefits from division inside the working class in society? It is the ruling class that benefit. And by fighting together, we might not agree when we start off the fight, but during the course of the struggle, people start to open their eyes to what is wrong with society, and they start to politically generalise, and we can start to win people, and we can start to win people over. And the fundamental starting point of that is that we stand 100% unconditionally with the oppressed when they are fighting for their rights, but that we understand that it is class that both shapes that oppression, explains that oppression, and the class struggle that can challenge that oppression, and that in that struggle, transgender people will be a central part of that fight. I'm going to have to stop there, thanks.
I'm Shay Brown. I actually know Sue through the NUT. I've spoken a lot at different trade union conferences about the experience of being transgender, and I've got to say that I agree with pretty much all of what Sue has said. You can talk about why do we have gender as a construct, gender as a social construct, that it's, you know, it's a made-up thing. But until you experience gender dysphoria and the feeling of looking in the mirror and feeling sick with your body, there's no one else in the room, no one is judging you but yourself, and it's you that's feeling sick at the shape that your body is, at the parts that your body has. Then once you've had that experience, you can't say that gender is only a construct. Yeah. There's more to it than that. Having said that, I think it's absurd that we separate things into boys and girls. I was, a colleague was leaving for maternity leave recently, and the head teacher in assembly asked whether the baby would be a pink baby or a blue baby, and I didn't want to say, well, I hope the baby's pink, because, you know. But there's things, gender segregation starts early on in society. I'm a primary school teacher, and there are separate events for boys and girls, absolutely nonsensically. Yeah. And so a young trans lad at the school he wasn't openly trans, so at that stage, so he had to run in the race with the girls. And then next year he came out as trans, and he ran in the race with the boys, and incidentally, he won the race out of the other boys. So it's just pure, you know, he's had no medical intervention. It's purely arbitrary. It's senseless. And there's the ways in which society is constructed, and so many people are unwilling to question. It's it baffles me, really. Yeah, that's about all I've got to say. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Who's next? Yeah.
Yeah, John Parrington, Oxford. Yeah, I'd like to add to what Sue said about the biology side of this, because I teach the biology of reproduction at Oxford University, and one thing you learn when you teach it is just how similar the reproductive systems are when it comes to hormones and things like that. Really, it's just, you know, the same hormones are involved. All right, some men have more testosterone and women have less, but, you know, we all have the same hormones and things, and there's an overlap between the sex in that sense. And actually, the more we're learning about genetics, we realise there are people out there, people with XXY, so-called Klinefelter syndrome, who look slightly more feminine, that's because they have an extra X chromosome. We don't really know, to be quite honest, what more subtle differences might exist that might explain why some people feel more a different sex than the one they're being assigned. But I think we can also say that even if it was just a feeling, if we couldn't find the biological basis, why shouldn't people choose to be a particular sex if they feel that's right for them? And I think it's interesting that actually in wider culture, in heterosexual culture, there's also, I think, a challenging to some extent going on of what it means to be a male or a female. So the traditional thing is that males are dominant, females are passive. But what about, practices like pegging, which is where a woman penetrates a male partner with a dildo? I mean, that's reversing some of the roles. There's articles in Cosmopolitan about this at the moment, which I think is a sign of how things are changing. Other signs of popular culture, Sue mentioned Miley Cyrus, who's come out as gender neutral. But even in, if you look recently Radio 1 at the moment of the top 10, there's a song called Power by Little Mix and Stormzy. Now, Little Mix, very feminine band, Stormzy very masculine. But what are the actual lyrics of the song? Well, it's basically the women in Little Mix saying, just because I take it down south doesn't mean I have to take it lying down. And then Stormzy comes back with a line about, why shouldn't the women wear the trousers? And I think those are really interesting kind of inversions of the traditional stereotypes of male and female roles in relationships. But I think the other thing we have to say is that we also have to see how this is a really positive thing in the sense that it's really challenging this idea of binary, binary ideas about, heterosexual or homosexual or male or female. But we can also see how history can reverse those kind of things. If you think about back to the 1920s in Germany, inspired by the revolution movement there, that was the place where you could be openly gay, you could openly look like a woman if you're a man or vice versa. And yet what happened? Hitler came to power, all that was smashed. And there are places in the world, where the Nazis are rearing their heads again. So I think we can't be complacent. Yeah. We've got to celebrate the change, but we shouldn't think it's inevitable. In many ways, it's because of the battles we fought in the past that we need to really intensify those battles and also challenge the people, like the professor at my university, who's a great feminist in many ways, but has gone along with this stuff like Julie Bindel and Jermaine Greer.
Thank you very much.
Okay, this is Nick Gill, Bristol SWP. I'll take Sue at her word and throw some ideas out because, as she said, we don't know what Marx had to say on the subject, so we have to apply a Marxist analysis. So, number one, is it possible, thinking about people like Germaine Greer, the exclusively radical feminists, it seems to me that those ideas seem to be an unwanted and possibly unexpected side effect of privilege theory. Because someone who didn't start out as being a woman must have more privilege than someone who's been a woman all her life, therefore is more privileged, therefore must be discounted, discarded, etc., etc. No, that's just one thought. Second thought, I know I have a friend who is a gay male Iranian refugee, and what he has told me I found quite astounding. In Iran, they do agree in the ideas of curing homosexuality, and gender reassignment surgery is considered as one way to cure it. And I suppose it's a result of being in a homophobic society with a relatively well-developed health service, and that was seen as one of the accepted ways of curing homosexuality, which I don't think contradicts the spirit of this meeting. What it just does say, I think, is that to tell someone that just because he fancies other men he can't identify as a male is as barbaric as the other examples we've heard of transphobia. Thirdly, ending on what I thought was not more optimistic note, I saw this programme with Rupert Everett on Channel 4, 50 Shades of Gay, about commemorating 50 years of the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, and it ended up with him interviewing a couple who, well, they were originally a straight couple. The man had transitioned, was now identified as a woman, and the partner had coined a new portmanteau word, tresbian, trans-lesbian, and I look forward to meeting more tresbians in the future.
Thank you very much. Who was number 4? Yeah.
Hiya. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. It's Phil Caswell, World Feminine Union. This issue on gender is incredibly important. In the World Feminine Union, we believe that the revolution for justice in the world is fundamentally prevented by a patriarchal political economy. And Marx's own theory is lacking in respect to a critical analysis of the sex dialectical relations. And the position that we've identified is that Marx is actually encapsulated under Aristotle's logos, and this represents the core theory for a patriarchal society. So that gender is dependent on the binary preconception in the first place, and that the binary preconception originated in the classical proto-fascist state of Athens. And before that, there existed kind of semi-matriarchal societies, and then during the collapse of the Bronze Age, which happened over just 70 years, this was followed by a Dark Ages, and then Athens arose out of those Dark Ages, and that gave us our language structure and our structure for meaning, which traps us in these binary oppositions in respect to our sexual identity. So when Marx gives the first division of labour, then he introduces an ontology of binary opposition, and it's this which is standing in our way in order to achieve a revolution. So we propose that we need to shift the class analysis away from binary opposition and unite across all classes and find women successfully bringing justice back to the world. And this doesn't exclude men. It's not, the concepts of man and woman are just ideological concepts, so it doesn't really matter which sex you are. You can really support the feminine critique. Thank you very much.
Hi, Conor Cooley, York and Manchester Central SWP. I just want to talk about one of the ways we can get more people to be accepted, and something that was really important for me was because I'm not trans, but I'm asexual, and well, I'm not, but roughly speaking, asexual. So when I was coming out, one of the things that was really important was having other people in my school who were LGBT, and that meant that people were somewhat aware of the different identities and being non-conforming. And I think one thing that's definitely important is having visibility for more people from an early age of non-binary and trans individuals, because that means that people who do feel that, you know, there's something that's not quite right, they have something that to look up to and go, am I like that? Yes, I am. No, I'm not. And also people who do conform, they know, like, this is something that's perfectly natural. It's not something that should be fought. It's something that should be accepted. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, it's not important to show solidarity and that sort of thing. I'm not saying that visibility is more important than, you know, fighting and struggling together. But I think it's definitely important to have that visibility in schools, in workplaces, blah blah blah, because then we can get more people fighting together.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me call some comrades new. The one at the back. And you would be next?
Yeah, great.
You would just be next, yes. Oh, yeah, okay. The third one, yeah. Just come here, it's fine. You will speak, yeah? Don't worry.
Thanks, Sue. That was great. I identify as gender non-binary. I've got 2 kids. I have a child that identifies as gender non-binary, trans, pansexual. I have another child who identifies as cisgendered, heterosexual. And what I think is that's absolutely fantastic, because they've just got this use of language, you know, and they're very comfortable with who they are, because they've obviously had me as a parent, they've got some great friends, etc. And that's been something that's been talked about for a very long time, since they were young. What I really wanted to talk about was like a little bit like there was just been spoken about in schools, and this whole thing around gender in schools. In primary schools, we're still too much about, okay, we do things like, can all the boys stand up, or can all the girls stand up? And, you know, we've got to just think about how we use our language on a database. There's some fantastic language out there, it still needs developing, but there is some fantastic language that's out there that we can use, and that's easier for young people. Young people understand and they get it. And I just wondered if the whole thing around trans kids, particularly in schools, if people knew like the process for a trans kid in the country, what happens to them. Shall I explain it? Shall I explain that? Yeah. So if a kid is trans in school, and, you know, we know kids are trans, they don't just want to wear maybe or play what we call the opposite sex, they are likely to tell you, yeah? They will tell us, you know, we don't have to make our minds up for them. What happens to them, they can go to the gender clinic, and they'll be put on a waiting list, which will take quite a long time, but hopefully they'll get through. And then they can be put on these things called blockers. Blockers are great. They give young people a chance to have a think about gender, the whole family to get together, and everybody to understand what is going on with their gender and their gender dysphoria, if that's so be it. At the age of 16, they can go on to hormones. Blockers are reversible, so if any time they want to stop taking the blockers, that's fine, that will reverse. At the age of 16, it does get a bit more serious, and they can go on to hormones, and some of that isn't reversible if they do start on hormones. And at the age of 18, they can choose to have sex reassignment if they feel it. Lots of trans people do not have sex reassignment if they are able to live as a gender that they want to live at, yeah? But you know, I am non-binary trans, but there is so many now. But when I was like, you know, if I'd had that when I was 15, 16, 17, that would have saved me so much hassle. So if we could be using that language, I think that would be just amazing. So that's it.
We're having quite a lot of people that want to speak, and that's good. 2 minutes, though, so we can fit everybody in. Thank you.
2 minutes? Oh, Cromwell, better be quick. Speaking earlier about the idea of the term TERF and things like that, originally, as far as I can tell anyway, what it originally meant when trans women used it was trans-exterminatory radical feminist, because these people were literally killing us, and in some senses they still are. They've still managed to collude with a lot of right-wing organisations and block access to healthcare and various other things like that essentially do amount to our death, unfortunately. But again, that's been changed over time to trans-exclusionary radical feminists, by, as far as I can tell, them to try and sort of tone it down, as it were. But again, it's become common use by trans women now. So it gets to the point where the argument over something like language and how we describe gender, and even the bad things surrounding gender as well, is just ridiculously complicated because of the whole thing around who's using it and what like that. And unfortunately, as a party, we kind of have to sort of learn from other trans people as we go along, but we are going to muck it up at points. There's no ifs or buts about this. I've mucked it up God knows how many times, and I'm deep in the middle of all this. But that's okay, because we can categorically come down with our arguments on the side of the fact that, yeah, these arguments are incredibly complicated and one-sided, and we will mess it up, but we are trying. As a party, we are trying to do this correctly. We are listening to you, and the only people who we can tell to fuck off are the people who are trying to police our expression in the first place. I mean, God only knows how I'm supposed to use this language. I'm transgender. I'm pretty sure I'm somewhere on the intersex spectrum as well. So God only knows what I'm supposed to do with this. You end up taking about 12 different terms to make sure you've covered everything by the end of it, and then you get the massively long acronyms of LGBTQIA. Some people have P on the end of it for polyamorous, and then you get debates about whether that should be involved in the queer community, and it all turns into a bit of a nightmare. And that's okay. That's okay. It's allowed to turn into a nightmare. We're dealing with a patriarchal society that screwed up our language for God knows how many years. It's okay it's cozy to be scared and get it wrong and think, oh God, it's a bit fucked. But yeah, it's always annoyed me when people have said, "Oh, you know, it's intersex, you know, it's all gone wrong." It's like, it didn't go wrong. I'm fucking gorgeous. Piss off. My girlfriends would like a word with you. I mean, even something like, you know, sex reassignment surgery, that's not used by lots of people anymore. It's turned into a gender affirmation surgery. You know, instead, it's one of those things you are going to have to learn as you go along, and you're not going to get it right, but that's okay. Genuinely, that's fine. Just muck up, admit, right? Sorry, I mucked up. It's fine. Oh, what do you want? What do you want me to use? Boom, sorted.
Please stick to 2 minutes. We need more people to speak. Thank you.
Hello. I've got quite a lot of notes, so I'll try and be quite quick. To start with, I am what you would call a transcritical feminist. I identified as trans since I was about 17. I'm 21 now, so a bit over 4 years. And I mean, I'll briefly cover the intersex thing first. The fact is that the vast majority of people are assigned a gender based on external genitalia that is usually a vulva or a penis, quite obvious. And it's about the gender socialization you brought up with there. And obviously, intersex people are, I think usually the estimate's about 1% for people who have an intersex condition. It's about 0.2% for people who are born with ambiguous genitalia. And therefore, obviously, they often have horrible surgeries. I agree that those surgeries shouldn't happen to children at all. In terms of gender being external and how can you say that when people have dysphoria, I believe that dysphoria is a disorder caused by gender socialization, by trauma of gender socialization, trauma of other things. When I identified as trans, all my circle of friends, all trans as well, and a few of them, since I've spoken to them about some things, have all started reconsidering the way they're viewing their dysphoria, and a lot of them have started linking that into how they were socialized and how you talked about Julie Bindel saying that she says that, you know, everyone who wears trousers would just be transitioned into being male or whatever. I think it is important to acknowledge that when you're only allowed to be a certain thing, when gender is making you be a certain thing, and I believe the system of gender is external and happens to us, then it does lead you to having a disconnect from your body and having a lot of, anguish about your own body and a lot of upset about it because you feel like you don't have the right body for what you're supposed to be and what you want to be. I also want you, talked about the idea of cis and trans and whatever you mentioned cis. I think these are such modern terms that they don't really apply to most people. The vast majority of people can't be categorized as cis because the vast majority don't identify with any gender really. The vast majority of people don't really have gender identity. It's a very new concept. Also, she said at the start that she was going to define gender, talk about what gender is. I didn't hear any definition of that other than a feeling.
I think in these debates it's quite clear that debates between the trans-exclusionary feminists and I'd call it trans activists or feminists who are in defence of transgender rights, whether they're cis or trans. I think it's obviously clear that trans activists get the worst brunt of it, and the establishment, most media, they're the ones who don't take their gender identity seriously enough. They don't take gender dysphoria seriously enough, or even if you don't necessarily experience gender dysphoria, they don't take the internal sense of being a different gender to what you were assigned at birth seriously enough. So I want to first say that. I think though there's a kind of entrenched positions on both sides though, which is a sort of dualism, where the radical femmes, or trans-exclusion radical femmes, they only recognise perceived biological sex and they think that gender identity in here doesn't exist. And then those who, I suppose, the queer theorists, they recognise gender identity existing, but they don't recognise perceived biological sex existing. Well, it seems that way to me. One side is all the body and none in here. The other side is all in here but none the rest of the body. And I think Sue was quite right. It's an interaction between the two. And I think, kind of want to look at, in a way, I'll try and be quick, the idea of, it's so entrenched, the idea of labelling somebody girl, labelling somebody boy, labelling somebody a man, labelling somebody a woman. It wouldn't take hold so easily if it wasn't for the fact there are physical differences, and very broadly speaking, I know there aren't just two different groups, but broadly speaking, when I walk down the street, I mean, I'm not non-binary, but if I was non-binary, I could still be misgendered as a woman, and because of how I look, I will get sexism. So that, as well as gender identity existing, you've also got the oppression existing of what you're externally read as, whether or not that's correct or not correct. And I think just very quickly, on the old Caster Semenya issue, and the idea of people assigned as male competing in sports, but on average, when you come into Olympic status or professional sport, people assigned as male will run faster on average and punch harder and jump taller than people assigned as female at birth. So I think we have to kind of... It's wrong what they're doing to Caster Semenya. She should be in women's sports. She identifies as a woman. She may or not be able to run faster than them. I think the problem is, though, because people assigned female at birth tend to, on average, run slower. On average, I said. They tend to be ring-fenced, and somebody who doesn't quite conform in every way is going to beat them in a race. But it's true. If you put Caster Semenya in the race for men, she'd probably come last. And I think we have to just accept that. When you have competitive sport, you have individuals, the fastest will always win, whoever it is. I don't think we should force people to have surgery or take hormone treatment. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Ree Jackson, Doncaster SWP. I've just got a question for Sue, really. Basically, would gender need to exist in a socialist society? Because, I mean, I sort of envisage a world in which, oppression doesn't exist and that everybody can, just be who they want to be, wear what they want to wear, do what they want to do, love who they want to love, and, it just not be a thing and not be an issue. So, just welcome your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for contributing to the discussion. I won't take a long time to reply, but just a couple of things, really. I mean, first of all, somebody talked about. I think it was the person who said that they identify as a transcritical feminist. Said that surgery shouldn't be forced on children. Well, surgery doesn't happen to children. Zed got up and talked about what happens to children in schools, and actually being prescribed hormone blockers, first of all, takes quite a long time and is a long process, and there's a lot of talking to people that goes on. And secondly, isn't surgery and is reversible, and it's a long stage before people get to it's a long stage before people get to before people get to surgery. So the question about, I suppose the key question then comes down to, is gender real? Does it really exist? And will it exist? Will it exist under socialism? And I haven't really given a proper definition of it. Well, what I was trying to give a definition of, if you like, which probably wasn't a definition, but what I was trying to explain is something that is really much more complicated than it has been thought of. Something that is much more to do with interactions. That is much more there between the physical world and the social world in which we live. In which there is much greater variability. I do think that if you actually talk to trans people, and I think Shay made a very strong case for it at the beginning about their feelings, that they talk in very physical terms, and I think the fact that we don't fully understand it should not be something that makes us not support people's rights. So this was the quote I was trying to find from Sam Hope, by the way, which says, the answer to the philosophical question of who are we really when you get right down to it is not necessary to know that gender reassignment, I appreciate the terminology that people mentioned before, but I'm quoting here, works for those who want it, saves lives, and saves the NHS a fortune in mental health service that will, in mental health services and so on. So in other words, that this is something that we have to respond to in practice in the here and now. I also think, to be honest, that, and I get a couple of people that kind of said, gender shouldn't really matter, or it doesn't really matter. I think when people are attacked because they want to identify strongly with a particular gender, whether that be male, female, or somewhere in between, or somewhere we haven't thought of yet, I think when people are attacked for that, then actually their gender identity does matter. And I think we should very much say that people are entitled to hold on to a range of gender identities. And what is wrong with that? Let's celebrate diversity. Let's celebrate this. It is capitalism that wants to stick us into these little boxes of boys and girls, and that part of the liberation of humanity has to be breaking out of that and defending our right to be identified in any way in which we want to identify. So I think that's very much in which the way we should talk, because once you stop talking like that, and again, actually I would dispute the figures, by the way, about the 0.1%. If you look at a lot of more recent scientific studies that follow a much broader range of hormonal and chromosomal differences, actually the statistics are much higher. And as somebody said earlier, because we start from a framework of male-female, then even when you're looking at these categories, there's a temptation to say male there, female there, and let's try and fit somebody else in the spectrum. If you start from something much more messy and complicated, who knows what we might end up with? And actually, will this disappear after the revolution? I don't know. But what I do know is that if people want to identify in any particular way, whether it's through their sexuality or their gender, that we will uphold their right to do so, and society will uphold their right to do so. And I think the revolution will actually be a celebratory process of people breaking out of all of their boxes and coming and taking part in that and celebrating the variety and difference that exists amongst human beings. I was at a very good talk, I can't remember whether it was yesterday now or today, or days have all blurred into one, about disability rights, actually. And we were and people were talking about how, in the revolution, actually people came out of the mental health institutions and started to take leadership roles within the, within the revolution. And we, let's celebrate this. These people that don't fit, it is abuse. It's not the surgery that is, transgender surgery that we do, or accepting children's right to have these different gender identities. That is not the problem. The problem is forcing them to live in these little boxes. That is what is abusive. That is what it causes dysphoria. That is what causes people to take their own lives. That is what causes people to self-harm. That is what causes people to get beaten up in the street. And we're against that. We're for the liberation and for the celebration of, for the celebration of diversity. And I think anybody who wants to fight for a better world really needs to start from that. Premise. And I'm sorry if it's a bit messy and so on, but actually, if you start with the practice, actually, then things become a bit clearer. If you start with what you do, it becomes a bit clearer. Who is going to police gender? I'll come back to that question. If you want people to live in these categories, who is going to police it? Is this now going to become the role of the progressive left? Are we going to set ourselves up as the gender police? I bloody well hope not. That's not the kind of progressive left that I want to be part of. Just quickly on the word cis, by the way. Cis is a Latin thing. What do you call a word that comes before another word? A pre-something or other. Prefix. That just means the opposite of trans. That's what it is. Trans means going across to the other side, and cis means staying on this side. So, it is a word, and, it's just a description, really. So you can not accept it all you like, but there you are. That's what it means. So I think, the question of, the question of the language is actually quite interesting. And I think it's great. And I think that we should celebrate it all and learn it all, and it will change. And that is also a good thing. I just want to finish with this, really, that I mentioned before actually two things. Before I finish with the last thing, is that if we're going to get to a truly liberatory society, I firmly believe that we need a revolution. I don't think this is ever going to be something that is legislated for by an assembly, however progressive, because it's one thing to pass legislation, it's quite another thing in practice to empower people and enable people to live their independent lives. And I think the sort of transformation of society that you're thinking about to celebrate that diversity actually requires turning the whole world upside down. And when I mentioned the quote by Angela Davis before about, what would it mean if the sign of the women's movement was a black, I think she said a person of colour actually was a trans person of colour. What would that mean? It made me think of a quote by one of the founders of our party, for those of us old enough to remember him, a man called Tony Cliff, and he often used to say that the revolution will be led by a 17-year-old black disabled lesbian. Now, he wasn't kind of trying to, put people in boxes. What he was trying to do was say, this is the real, this is what we mean by a festival of the oppressed. This is what we mean by diversity, by standing together, by fighting back together. This is what we mean by liberation. And I would just like to paraphrase that a little bit, actually, because I think the revolution will be led by lots of young people, lots of black people, lots of people with all sorts of gender identities and sexualities that we haven't even thought of names of yet, and it will be magnificent because of that. And if you want to help us make that happen, please join us.